Good evening and welcome to this evening's Aston History online seminar, 9/11 as Global History, Memories from New York, Birmingham and Ghazni. I am Brian Sadul and I'm joined by my colleague Professor Stefan Mantz this evening and three guests whom I will introduce in a few moments. One of the key aims of our degree programs here at Aston University and of our research in the history department is to undertake the study of global history from the heart of the city of Birmingham. And we hope this evening's seminar contributes to both dimensions of this agenda. But before we begin, let's take a little step back in time. If you were an adult in September 2001, living in North America or Europe, or indeed anywhere with access to televised news or to one of those new internet news channels from the period, you probably remember very well where you were and what you were doing when you heard that two airplanes had hit the World Trade Center in New York on September the 11th. The attack in New York struck such an iconic building, one that was not just American but international in its identity, that at least for people around the globe, its significance easily overshadowed the attack on the Pentagon and the crash of the flight United 93, which together killed over 200 people on the same day. 2 weeks before the attack, I sat on a baking hot sidewalk of a Manhattan street to get a better angle as I took a photo of the breathtaking architecture of the Twin Towers before ambling into a beautiful deli opposite one of the side entrances to find some lunch. Somewhere else on that hot August day, the 19 future hijackers and their 2,977 victims probably sat down to their own lunches. Global history, indeed world history, is full of such moments of mundanity, or, to borrow a word from Hannah Arendt, banality, before or after the horror that can surround them. Of course, while the death of any victim in any country is a horror to those who lose loved ones, not every tragedy becomes a global event with global consequences on every continent. In this regard, 9/11 was a landmark event. The aim of this evening's seminar is not to go over ground that many seminars and publications have evoked about the diplomatic, political, and military consequences of 9/11. Instead, our aim is to delve into the personal histories of those whose own lives were touched by the fallout of those attacks and whose experiences tend to go under the radar of historians. Garrett M. Graff's The Only Plane in the Sky, The Oral History of 9/11, published in 2019, described many such moments of ordinary daily life overtaken in an instant by what happened that day. Yet its focus is understandably on those directly affected by the attacks, rather than those whose lives were changed indirectly. The importance of this layer of the cultural history of 9/11 was brought home to me by our colleague, Dr. Ilaria Scalia, who once told me a story about speaking to a man in a turban on 11th of October 2001 at Toronto International Airport, the day she arrived in North America to begin her doctoral studies. "Thank you," he said to her when they parted ways. "Nobody has spoken to me since 9/11. How, we should now ask, did other individuals find their lives impacted by popular reactions to 9/11, or reshaped by the impersonal forces of the diplomatic, political, military, and cultural upheavals of the attacks that the attacks unleashed? The irony in this last example, of course, is that the man in a turban was a Sikh. For our seminar this evening, we welcome our guests, Mr. Sadul Haque Saeed, lead organizer of Citizens UK Birmingham, and Dr. Homira Rezai, chair of the Hazara committee in the UK. Both of our guests are Muslims, and both were living in countries halfway around the globe from the events in the USA, respectively in Birmingham, UK, and Ghazni, Afghanistan. But their stories, while very different, both offer perspectives on the consequences of 9/11 that surprise and inform, and also give us a window into the cultural ripples of the events that day in the USA. Historians are all about hidden histories these days, and the testimonies that our guests offer deserve to be better known and better understood. Before we listen to them, however, we welcome Dr. Andrew Hammond, tuning in from the United States. Dr. Hammond is historian and curator of the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center. He was formerly Mellon Public Humanities Fellow at the National September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York, and also, I remember with great fondness, a lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University. His book Struggles for Freedom, Afghanistan and US Foreign Policy since 1979 will be published by Edinburgh University Press. And so it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Andrew back to his one-time home to speak to us about 9/11 itself.
Well, thank you, and let me share my screen with you. Okay, has that came through okay?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. And the world has went pretty crazy since the last time I saw you all in the summer of 2019. So yeah, I'm just going to speak for a little bit about 9/11 here in New York. I'm actually in New York at the moment, although I'm based in Washington, D.C. So let me just go from the start. So 9/11 is global history. So I'm just going to break that down into global, national, and local. Okay, one of the reasons that we're here today is that 9/11 casts a long shadow. So 20 years on, in fact, tomorrow, the 25th of November, will be the 20th anniversary of the first American casualty after 9/11. So we hear of 9/11 as global history. So there's a number of different parts to that, I think. I think there's the whole world is involved in this story. This is the most globally witnessed event in human history. So there's definitely a global component to it. Here in the United States, it was an attack on the military center of power, the Pentagon, the center of government. So the plane that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, was said to be bound for the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. And last, and of course, most well known, an attack on the symbols of American financial power in New York City. So you see here the remnants of one of the towers that once stood here. At one point, the two largest buildings in the world. Okay, so there's a number of parts to this story in New York, I think. There's memory, which I'm going to go on to discuss, but there's also the physical landscape. So you see at the top here what Manhattan is thought to have looked like before it was settled. See Manhattan, the island in the middle, Brooklyn over to the right, New Jersey over to the left. And then you see the same, more or less the same image down below, but you see the effect that mass settlement had on the island of Manhattan. And one of the things that's so interesting about New York is that it's a very global city. So we are talking about the New York story, but we're also talking about the story of New York in many ways is also a global story. People from all over the world came there. The original tip of Manhattan was at one point the Dutch were there originally. So I think it's a little bit overdrawn to say, well, you know, New York is New York and the world is something else. I think that both of them link into one another. And as you said at the beginning, Brian, historians like to play different types of ways of analysing things. And I think one of the ways that you can analyse this is to look at the effect that the world has had on New York and the effect that New York has had on the world, and we can make 9/11 part of those Russian dolls. Okay, and again, just to before I narrow in, just to broaden it out and keep the links between the local and the global together. Let's think about what came after 9/11, the longest war in the history of the United States. So this past summer, we saw the end of it, and the phase that we had known it most, which was the long war, the war in Afghanistan. So New York, those events that happened in New York led to the events that have taken place as well in Afghanistan. And of course, the global war on terror, the so-called global war on terror, it was global. It was the Philippines, it was Iraq, it was Afghanistan, it was a number of other countries. Okay, but I'm just going to focus in on New York. Okay, just to give you a little bit of context, where you see the red arrow here, that where the arrow begins, like the base of the long part of the arrow, that's where I was based for just over 2 years. And every day I would sit at my desk and look down and see the remnants of the Twin Towers. So this is something that is seared into my brain. And as a researcher, as an academic, I was constantly thinking about how all the various intersecting parts of this story could best be fit together. So it was really, really interesting to me as a historian. It was also interesting to me as a human being. So I was in Germany when this happened. Talk about the global story of 9/11. Okay, so it's left a physical scar, like you just saw there, but it's left scar tissue in the collective consciousness of New Yorkers in the story of that city. So here's one person who is reflecting on it. It hurts to even look in that direction. They don't even like to look there. And here's someone else, someone I personally know. I don't get down there no more. So this person was in downtown Manhattan when all of this happened. And afterwards, they had to undergo intensive therapy for anxiety, for a number of other mental health issues. So there's a scarring of the consciousness and unconsciousness of New Yorkers and of the history of the city. You see here one of the iconic images of that day. So the Statue of Liberty, and then Lower Manhattan shrouded in dust. So I'm going to focus in on 3 stories. So there's just, this story is so broad. It's even in a 5-hour presentation, I couldn't even do justice to the New York part of the story. So I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to give you a few examples which I think are illustrative of a larger point. So the first one is Marisa DiNardo Sharp. So in September the 10th, 2001, Marisa organized a birthday party for her mother on Windows to the World. So this was the restaurant that was at the top of the Twin Towers. So she had a nice birthday party with her mother. All of her family were there. They were there until 1:30 in the morning. But she had to be in work early the next morning. She was a trader at Cantor Fitzgerald. Now, everybody at Cantor Fitzgerald, the company, everybody that showed up for work that day would die on 9/11. So unfortunately, Marisa was one of those people. And you see on the bottom left, some of the artifacts that the 9/11 Museum has on her life. So as Brian said, that's where I used to work. And I found it quite fascinating thinking about the links between material culture, memory, photography, and all those good things. But this is her mother. So we obviously don't have Marissa's oral history, but this is her mother talking about it. This is from the 9/11 Museum. So this is her talking about the night before. I feel like I'm up in heaven. It's so pretty. And she said to me, Mum, I got you on top of the world. The next morning, when I saw the plane hit the North Tower, and that's where she was, I says, probably she's helping somebody. Probably she got down. I could not think that she was not around anymore. This is the restaurant here, and you can see a close-up of the receipt from that dinner. So just think about that. The evening before, celebration, treating her mother, taking the family out for a nice dinner, and then the next day, Marissa dies. So moving on to someone else. So Adrian Walsh, she's a New York City firefighter. Now she survived 9/11, but she was in a very dangerous and perilous situation. So you see her on the right here. Later in her career, she goes on to become the first female lieutenant firefighter and goes on to be one of the first people that heads up a New York Fire Department search and rescue team, a very elite unit of the FDNY. And you see one of the famous images on the bottom left here from that day. So the towers are smouldering, they're getting ready to come down, but the firefighters are going in the opposite direction of everyone else. Everyone else is trying to get away. They're heading towards danger. So Adrian was one of the firefighters that day. And you see her there. I saw what I can only describe as almost like a tornado hurtling at me. Just this cloud of dust that had to be over 100 feet in the air, and it was literally circling. It was just bearing down. I mean, I'd never seen anything like that, and anything move as fast as that. And I turned around and I yelled, "Run, cat, run." So again, I'm only reading out small excerpts. There's entire oral histories from each of the people that I'm going to speak about today. I just think that it helps with moments like this. We're talking about the global history of 9/11. The history of the globe is made up of millions, billions of individual stories that collectively make up the rich and diverse and sometimes horrifying, sometimes beautiful tapestry of human history. And the three people that I'm speaking about today, this is just a fragment of each of their stories. And then we see here on the bottom left, another one of the iconic images from 9/11. So in some ways, this is similar to a famous photograph that was taken at the Battle of Iwo Jima, US Marines raising a flag. And then over on the right, you see what's called the last column. So this is a piece of World Trade Center steel that's installed at the 9/11 Museum. And you can see on it the number of first responders who perished that day. So we have FDNY, so Fire Department New York, 343 firefighters died that day. So the largest loss of life in the FDNY's history. Just to put this in perspective as well, this was the largest crime scene in American history too. Okay, and last but not least, Niloufar Mina. So Niloufar was born in Iran. She witnessed the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and like many Iranian Americans, came to the United States. And in Niloufar's case, came to New York. So she was in downtown Manhattan on 9/11, cycling on her bike, and she witnessed 9/11 at close hand. And for her, she started comparing and contrasting in her head both of these events, the Iranian Revolution and September 11th, 2001. So as Brian said, the history is littered with these small incidents that gather volume until there's a breaking point and the water breaks over the top of the glass. And we see two of them here, but within each one of them, there's an infinite amount of smaller events. And Niloufar, Mina's life, is an important part of each of those. So this is her talking here. I am still engulfed in depression and anxiety and do not quite understand why. This is her just a few months afterwards giving this testimony. It reminded me of the period of revolution in Iran. The events that led to my present life in downtown New York became once again vivid. There is an unbelievable force and power witnessing thousands die in front of you. There was nothing to hide under. It was scary and unbelievable, like a Godzilla movie. So I think another part of 9/11 as well is, so globalization. I used to teach this on my the Making of the Modern World course at Aston. Globalization, one of the best definitions is space-time compression. So the compression of space and time. So if we think about back during the American Revolution, it could take months to cross the Atlantic. Now, information can travel instantaneously around the world. And human beings are connected now in more ways than they have ever been. And we see here, an event happens in Iran, but Niloufar ends up in New York. And then something happens in New York, which leads to other events in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. So right there in this story, you have a great example of how the world is knitted together. And if you want a more light-hearted example, the reference to a Japanese movie, Godzilla, can be an illustration of the globalization of culture. Okay, and just to bring this back out again, so I started off speaking about the globe and then I narrowed in looking at New York. So those three stories that you heard are part of the fabric of New York City. New York, there's Queens, the borough of Queens, one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, is the most globally diverse place on the planet. New York City is made up from people from all over the world. But on 9/11 itself, the image on the top left is the flags, is an area in the 9/11 Museum where you have, I think it's around 99 flags that represent all of the countries that people that died in 9/11 came from. So again, it's a New York story, it's a local story, it's seared into the history and fabric of the city, but it's also a global story. It's got global connections because of the type of city New York is. And then you see on the bottom right here a map, and all of the countries in blue are countries who had citizens that died on 9/11. So it's a global story. So we're speaking about the global history of 9/11. We're looking at a few cities around the globe, and we're using them to explore some of these other themes. But I think that each of the cities, each of the countries, they're all interlinked and interpenetrated in so many numerous ways, which again was something that I used to bludgeon my students with when I was teaching the Making of the Modern World. Okay, and just to wrap up, there's an afterlife as well physically. So this is some steel from the World Trade Center. You see it's been made here on the top right into a sword. So the sword has been used for American veterans to make a pledge over. So you see on the bottom left here, they're all touching the sword. And this is an example of an event that I went to where everybody that you see in the frame is either touching the sword or touching someone who's touching the sword. Just think about this. This is almost religious. It has almost religious connotations. It's a revered, almost holy artifact. Some people have described Lower Manhattan to me, Ground Zero, as sacred ground, holy ground. And when they touch this piece of World Trade Center steel, so just think about it, a piece of steel is a piece of steel is a piece of steel. It's the meaning behind the steel that's important. And when they touch that steel, I'm just going to skip through because it's a couple of minutes. When they touch that steel, they make this pledge: I will not take my own life by my own hand until I talk to my battle buddy first. My mission is to find a mission to help my warfighter family. So veterans in the United States, like in many other countries, have certain ongoing issues. If you listen to or read the Iliad by Homer, you hear about all of the after effects of war, the effects on a community, the effects on a culture, the effects on a society. And that's certainly the case here, and it's certainly the case in every country where these types of things take place. And then this is an event that the 9/11 Museum has every year called the Tribute in Light. So this is meant to represent the Twin Towers. It's very, very moving if you ever get a chance to go there. And whenever you're in New York, if you're walking around and meeting people, you'll always meet people that have a connection, that lost a loved one on 9/11, or that have someone that ended up serving in the military afterwards in the post 9/11 wars. But this is a view from New York, where I am now. But it's a whole variety of views that help to round out this story. But I think I've given you a few interesting ones, and through these three lives, we get an insight into how 9/11 was experienced in New York City. Thank you, and back to Brian.
Andrew, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. And I think what you have said there underlines very much the spirit that we've wanted in this event tonight. That particularly for those of us outside the United States, it's very easy to see the United States in its political and military might, and with its identity as this grand superpower. But I think the stories that you've shared there have underlined the personal, the local, these tangible ripples where individuals have been truly affected by the events of 9/11. So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to turn now. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Stefan Mans, because he's going to be interviewing our first guest this evening, who's going to talk about their own memories of 9/11 and its aftermath in their own community on the other side of the world. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Brian, and especially Andrew, for that wonderful overview that really brought home the global story to a local context. And this is exactly where we will continue now. We will really bring that story home for our local audiences in Birmingham and the West Midlands. And it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Mr. Sadul Haque Saeed, who is now being tuned in. Hi, Saeed. Saeed is a senior organizer for Citizens UK for the West Midlands. He has been living in the West Midlands since 1984, so has witnessed 9/11 from the distance, so to speak. He's had a distinguished career in the public sector, and is now mainly concerned with as a community organizer for Citizens UK. And what we will do in our conversation is first talk a little bit, or we'll ask Saeed about his personal memories of 9/11, and then we'll branch out a little bit, because in a way Saeed represents a wider community within the West Midlands, and we'll move to that part in the second part of our conversation. So thank you very much, Saeed. Could I just kick off with the first question? So could you tell us a little bit what your personal memories of 9/11 were?
So September the 11th, 2001 was the first time I never had to go to lectures in September. I had graduated that summer from just up the road, University of Birmingham, in social policy, sociology. And for the first time in my life, I never had to go to a lecture or a classroom in September. So I was actually getting ready for my first job interview on September 13th. And when 9/11 happened, it was all over the news. Of course, we were watching it in the morning here, in the afternoon. And, we were all glued to our TV screens. We just could not understand what was going on. It just, it's quite emotional and heart-wrenching hearing what Andrew was sharing about some of the stories, but at that time it just seemed like a movie, a live movie that we were watching on the screen. Like you say reality is a lot more stranger than fiction. We just could not believe what we were seeing, what was going on. And of course, people ring family and relatives in the United States. I have relatives in Chicago. For some reason, my mum and dad, we were contacting our uncle in Chicago. Like, none of all the incidents as kind of described were happening around, particularly New York with the Twin Towers. But, you ring to see if people are okay and what's going on. So that was the kind of immediate shock of seeing on all our television screens. I don't think you kind of moved away from a television screen to see what's going on. And of course, at that time, I had no idea of what the consequences of this will be. You are just like every other citizen, thinking about all of those people and the loss and the hardship and the trauma and the heartbreak that they're going through at that time.
Could I pick up on this? Because we've got a number of younger listeners as well. We've got some students who might just about have been born at the time. In any case, don't have any personal memories of that. So you just said you didn't quite know at the time about the importance of this. Did it not hit you in some way that this could be a seminal event that would define the years to come as well? Because you were a student, you had just graduated, so you had a sense of history, of politics, of the importance of events. Did it strike you in any way that this might be a really important event?
No, absolutely. It was a huge moment. I can't remember anything else in my life, where you're seeing something global, that you're part of because you're a viewer, you're in the audience. But there were things that in my education, head teachers, lecturers have kind of planted about the world as it should be. And I wasn't sure, like, those kind of things about human rights, democracy. I'd just done a course around that. Of course, sociologists is a bit more critical about power, but at that point, I had no idea that kind of rose-tinted world as it should be that my educators had presented, up until that certificate I got that summer, was about to crash. You know, I knew there were going to be reactions to find out who they were, and you know, and those people brought to justice. You know, the kind of things that you see in movies. You imagine, you know, a very elite squad of soldiers and navy going after terrorist camps, for instance. But the idea of, you know, wars in two countries, you know, and the idea of actual societal change for not just Muslims, but ethnic minorities too, here in the UK, you know, I had no idea at that point that what I'd learned, what I'd got a certificate in, was about to come crashing down.
Interesting, yeah. So if we now look at the days and years after the event, so let's stick with your kind of personal experience around this. What kind of effect did this have on your personal life, thinking, career, community engagement, etc.? So the effect on yourself.
Yeah. So I grew up and I still live here. I live in a very diverse neighborhood where I'm used to seeing other Muslims and non-Muslims. So I'm not in a part of Birmingham or the West Midlands where it's really difficult to see non-white folks. So in a way, you have a bit of a cushion on your kind of like neighborhood life. But I was very aware that you know, there was something changing in the city. So I live in a part of the neighborhood, part of the city in 2005 that had a riot. You know, the official description is disturbances. They don't use the word riot because it has some connotation about something about policy. But I do vividly remember, you know, it was a riot here in Les Isles that took place literally like yards away from where I live. Started on the Les Isles Road, and I do remember seeing on WhatsApp clips of individuals who were planning to come to the neighborhood to have a fight, to riot, and using things like, we got to go beat up these guys, the Muslims, because their book tells us to do jihad against us. And if, you know, there's a longer story about the riots, and, you know, there was a moral panic about an issue on a pirate radio station, and communities were really concerned about it. But to kind of see this WhatsApp message, which has got nothing to do with that particular moral panic issue, but create a different one. And I was pretty surprised at the reaction of young people, because, you know, not far from where we are, there's a mosque, and it was Ramadan, and they weren't going to leave the mosque and go home in a way. So something that was a kind of very localized kind of issue, easily with the connotations of 9/11, turned into something different about mainly violence, young men, and identity. So that's my kind of immediate experience in 2005. But you then start to see lots of milestones and pivotal points in our city, and how those in authority reacted and communities reacted. So you immediately see, you know, the Trojan horse affair. Everyone is very familiar with it. The idea of, you know, a plot to take over schools and apply extremist kind of principles. The idea of spy cameras, not idea, they were there on Ladypool Road and Stratford Road, which was put in a predominantly diverse community with Muslims living there. How that was very publicly kind of installed until it took someone from King's Heath contacting the Guardian newspaper for it to be headline news. So, you know, the story of Prevent, which was the reaction, you know, to how in America George Bush was looking at, right, we've got to find them before they find us. And the story of Prevent is littered with people at work feeling put under the microscope, and particularly young people. So, you know, and the impact it's had on students. And just to bring it further, you know, majority of the hate crime incidents that are reported are Islamophobia. We are currently in Islamophobia Awareness Month. November is Islamophobia Awareness Month. So you kind of, when I say this thing kind of crashing down, you kind of see that the crashing down wasn't just haphazard, It was organized crashing down. So, one of the things I was really unfamiliar with was passive aggressive. I grew up in a neighborhood, poor. If someone wanted to beat you up, they'll tell you very profoundly in some lovely swear words what they were going to do. But I felt people were had so much hate in them, whether it was on social media, now that's ballooned, but in person, that they didn't need to swear at you. Go back home, who are you, Taliban, those things. I used to I realized a number of my friends who wouldn't wear the kind of traditional dress. And of course, I know of people who've been affected, particularly a lot of women who wear the hijab. So the whole reaction to 9/11 in Birmingham, I mean, I failed to mention a number of other incidents. When you're growing up, so particularly if you were small or you weren't around watching what happened in 2001, the world for you in this city is a lot different for me as a teenager. For me as a teenager, when they saw a bearded guy at the bus stop, some people thought, here's a brother. This guy isn't going to say anything to you and you're kind of safe, sat at the bus stop with him. But that kind of changed, And when I say here's a brother, I don't mean by other Muslims. I mean by non-Muslims. I remember once someone said to me when I was younger, are you dressed like how the prophets dressed? And after 9/11, wearing my Islamic clothes, you dress like a terrorist. So the implications are still going on to this day.
Very interesting and actually eye-opening to get your view on all this. So you've just outlined the reactions of the, for want of a better word, majority community towards your community. Could we do this the other way around now? So how did people within the Muslim community actually react? What were different reactions towards those reactions? Did some withdraw? Did some maybe not withdraw? Or were there new communities that were emerging? So a couple of reactions from within the community, again, very much in line with what Andrew told us, these kind of very personal reactions.
Yeah, so I think there were concern by parents of their children, young people, like just traveling around. And before it became widely noted on social media, they were concerned about well-being. There was a huge concern about places of worship feeling spied on, feeling as there's this whole thing about non-violent extremism, like the kind of prevalence amongst decision politicians, people who felt that if you go to the mosque, you become an extremist. All these extremists are coming. Of course, a lot of the research is saying you can make yourself an extremist sat on your own on the internet, and so there was suspicion, there was concern in places of worship. But I have to say that it wasn't just victimhood going on. I do got to credit some of the leaders within the city, civil society, public leaders, who worked through so many challenges. Because one thing I'm not mentioning, I haven't mentioned, and I should mention, not just the kind of experience of the Muslim community. Remember, we've had terrorist attacks here in the UK. We've had sole individuals taking people's life. The Lee Rigby murder, the Westminster Bridge attack. Apparently, the person had stayed in Birmingham, and of course 7/7. There were these milestone incidents, which was constantly testing community relations. So it was easier for Muslim communities where they are around other Muslims in part of the city and the region, and where you weren't part of those communities, it wasn't that they were discriminated against, but you felt it more if you were poorer. So if you were in social housing, you were in an estate that wasn't super diverse, some people felt it because you don't have the means to go and move somewhere else. I spoke to one person, they had their car damaged on 14 occasions, so much so that the insurance company said, we can't insure you again. And it was after the nth number of occasions reporting it that the local authority had agreed to move them to another part of the city, not from where they were in South Birmingham. So if you were poorer and you were from Muslim communities in particular, it was a bit, you felt it harsher than if you were some folks who had those means.
Yeah, thanks very much for this really interesting insight to your community and your own experiences. I'm sure we'll pick up some of these issues later in the panel discussion. We are now moving to a different part of the world, and I'll hand over to Brian.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Saeed, for sharing those memories. And I think what you've been saying there has continued that story that's been unfolding through, first of all, through what Andrew said, and then what you were saying yourself about lives right across the globe being affected by those events that day. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome now Dr. Homira May Rezai, and May is the chair of the Hazara Committee in the UK, and is one of the leading human rights and women's rights activists in the Hazara diaspora. Aside from leading the British Hazara community, she works with the Hazara diaspora in various countries around the world. Her human rights work focuses on the situation of Hazaras, women, and ethnic and religious minorities in Afghanistan and Pakistan. She also holds a PhD in medical research and is operations lead at Mirzaim Therapeutics. And it's a great privilege for us to have you in this seminar, May. And thank you very much for agreeing to share your story with us. I'm going to hand over to you to talk, first of all, a little bit about your own memories, and then perhaps I can ask a few questions in a few minutes' time.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for having me and for organizing this very important event. I think it's been 20 years, and I think it's really good to get together and to look at what happened and the experiences from different areas around the world, and the sort of things that we've experienced. So when 9/11 happened, Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that were controlled by the Taliban. I was young, I was 8-9 years old, but I knew the situation in Afghanistan, so it was not normal because we, the Hazaras, were facing persecution by these terrorist groups. At that time, the only way we would receive any information was through radios or news outlets, radio stations, and we would always listen to the news. As a child with my grandparents, and we would always hear how many Hazaras were killed here and there. So our lives were really entwined with this horrible news all day, every day. And so I never really comprehended the situation. I just knew that it happened, but it was just another news of these atrocities or attacks. Because the times when it happens, like I said, Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban, and these attacks were really normalized. And then for us, especially for us, because we were so used to hearing thousands of people getting killed every day, especially for the Hazaras. But I remember when the news of 9/11 was spreading in our communities, and the elders were discussing the attack. But at the same time, we really were busy what was happening in our own community. And so we would just listen to the news and think of it as another attack. And at that time, Hazaras were really facing extinction, and the persecution of the Hazaras were really intensified. But I do understand that maybe not everyone is familiar about the Hazaras. So I'm going to give a very short historical context about the Hazaras and the persecution of Hazaras in Afghanistan. So the Hazaras are one of the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan who have been persecuted by the Taliban and ISK due to their religious belief. But this persecution has a long history in Afghanistan. The Hazaras, whose Asiatic appearance, like myself, distinguishes us from the rest of Afghans and have been historically persecuted, oppressed, and enslaved since the dawn of the 19th century. Although there never has been a religious war in Afghanistan, Hazaras are persecuted because of their Shia belief since the 1890s, when Emir Abdul Rahman Khan, the king or the Afghan king, declared a decree of jihad against the Shia Hazaras. According to a British historian, Jonathan Lee, around 50% of the whole Hazara population were either slaughtered or forced to leave their lands during the war of Emir Abdul Rahman Khan. And between the 1890 to 1893, in the span of 3 years, thousands of Hazaras were sold as slaves. Hazara women and Hazara lands were distributed among the Pashtuns, and thousands of Hazaras were displaced in the region. And I think in the 19th October 1983, it was when the Times London reported that the Emir of Afghanistan sold 10,000 Hazara captives to pay for the expenses that incurred in suppressing a revolt. And so a genocide happened in the 1890s, but the campaign against the Shia Hazaras became so prominent that the slogan "Hazara infidels" became normalized, and the persecution and enslavement of Hazaras systematically continued. So going back to during the Taliban regime, or when the 9/11 happened, or during the Soviet invasion, actually going a little bit before that, we had extremist groups were formed and they were ruling in Afghanistan. And these extremist groups see the Hazaras as kafirs or infidels. They took power of Afghanistan in 1996 through the Taliban. And so they launched a proper campaign to clean Afghanistan of what they call the kafirs or filthy Hazaras. And as a result of this campaign, it led to thousands of Hazaras being massacred and displaced, including the 1998 in Mazar-e-Sharif, where more than 10,000 Hazaras were killed. And we also have other examples, such as in October to November 1998, when Hazaras were trying to escape from Central Highland to Quetta, more than 10,000 Hazara passengers were taken in Kandapusht during their journey, and they were either, they never were found or they were killed. Also in May 2000, in Baghlan province, Taliban killed hundreds of Somali Hazaras and forced thousands of Hazaras to leave their homes and villages. We have another very prominent massacre called the Khaolang Massacre, very widely reported by Human Rights Watch, where hundreds of Hazaras were killed. And I'm also sure many of us may remember the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamyan in March 2001, which is a cultural cleansing against the Hazaras. So, Hazaras were facing it's a huge persecution. The intensity of the Hazaras were so great at that time. And the Taliban at that time announced that all Hazara lands had to be given to Pashtuns and Kochis. And as a kid, we would always turn to our grandparents and think, when is it our turn, and when are we going to get persecuted so that our lands would be given to Kochis? And so we were incredibly worried about the situation of our people and the situation in Afghanistan. But of course, from a wider perspective, Hazaras were worried that terrorist groups were going to be killing and to be extending their operation, not just within the region, but also internationally. We at that time, Hazaras suffered so much from persecution, forced taxation. We even had to wear a mark to show that we were Hazaras during that time. And so this was the situation of the Hazaras that I remember. But the sort of real changes that occurred to the Hazara communities was really after the Operation Enduring Freedom, or the OEF, which was launched in October 2001. And this was really a hope for the Hazaras to be saved from this persecution and these atrocities that was being committed by the Taliban. I'm happy to, Brian, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Sure. Thank you very much. And in fact, you've just anticipated one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which was about the latter half of 2001, and I just wondered what you remember about hearing the news about the Americans coming to Afghanistan. And I suppose, well, perhaps even before you come to that, I wonder if you remember what people used to say about Americans before they came to Afghanistan, or before there was talk of them coming to Afghanistan. I'm thinking, for example, in the in the Shia community in Iran, for example, America was known as the Great Satan, wasn't it? So I'm just wondering what was the talk amongst the Hazaras about America, and then how did it change?
Because, like I said, the persecution was so intense by the Taliban. Hazaras saw Americans as their saviors because we had no other options. Hazaras were forgotten. We didn't have any international support. We didn't have any regional support at that time as well. And there wasn't even a condemnation of these atrocities that was being committed by the Taliban against the Hazaras. So Hazaras really saw the Americans as the only hope that they would be saved from extinction. Yes, the Iran, they still see America as their enemy, but of course we also know that Iran are supporting the Taliban, and the Taliban are committing atrocities against the Shia Hazaras in Afghanistan. So I don't think the perception of Iran really changed the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan, or their perception of America really changed the perception of Hazaras in Afghanistan. So yes, Hazaras, we welcomed the international presence in Afghanistan. We welcomed, and we were the biggest and the biggest allies and supporters of the international presence in Afghanistan, as well as liberty, freedom, and democracy. Hazaras were we did lead or spearheaded the civil change that we saw in Afghanistan. From we had the highest number of female participations in politics, in field of music, sports. So you name the field, and Hazaras were the ones who were spearheading the change in there. And for me, I was born during the first Taliban regime, and because I was a girl, I was not able to go to school and get an education. And when the Taliban regime fell, or when the international community came to Afghanistan, and from 2003 I was able to go to school and get an education. So that was personal change that I saw in my life, that as a woman, I saw them as a savior, clearly, because before that I couldn't even get my basic human rights, which was an education, to go and get an education as a woman. And that was something that they immediately changed when they came to Afghanistan.
Can I ask, how did that feel, that moment when you were able to walk into a classroom?
It was, we didn't actually have any classroom to begin with. We had tents and marquees, but I do remember that feeling of going there and getting our UNICEF kind of bag. I remember the logo was there. It was blue. I remember the pens and the papers, and I remember coming home with these stationaries and saying, I am going to go to school. I'm going to be learning the same things as my male cousins who were learning. And it was an incredible feeling, being a kid at that age, and getting finally something that you've so desired the most, because you were seeing your male cousins going to school, getting education, and as a woman you were not able to do.
Yeah. And how did your male cousins feel about that change as well?
It was definitely welcomed by the Hazara communities because, within our culture and within our sort of social life practices, we see women as equal, and that was something that was truly welcomed by the Hazara communities, and that is why, now the literacy rates among men and women in the Hazara populated areas are equal, because we were able to adapt and welcome education and democracy and liberty in Afghanistan. There's a writer, actually explorer, British explorer, called Captain John Wood. And in his book, I'm trying to remember the name of the book, where he says, it's called A Journey to the Source of the River Oxus. And he described the Hazaras, and I quote, and this was in 1872. He goes, "The Hazaras females go unveiled. The women are by no means shy of strangers, but I believe that what is in a Muslim country appears a want of modesty is only freedom from liberty in which both sexes are equal." So the Hazaras had gender equality in 1872 in Afghanistan. And of course, he then goes on to say that the Hazaras are Shias, heretics in the eyes of Sunnis, and those orthodox detractors assert that such a creed is a cloak for every crime. So of course, as Captain John Wood describes, this perception of Hazaras led to a genocide of Hazaras just 20 years after the publication of his book. But of course, the gender equality is practiced among the Hazaras even in 1872, and it sort of remains. So when we had the international presence who were promoting democracy and gender equality, it was very much welcomed by the Hazara community.
We're coming to the end of this part of the seminar, and perhaps I should just point out to anyone who's watching that we are hoping to do a seminar, aren't we, on the history of the Hazara people, and sometime in the new year, and we'll be inviting you back at that time to come to talk about this issue. And I think everything that you've said is so pertinent, both with regard to the Hazaras, but also I think important as well to understand your perceptions on the ground when Operation Enduring Freedom began. I do have one more question for you, though, and I'm sure it's a question that many people who are watching will have as well, which is, there you were, a little girl in Afghanistan. You find yourself in the classroom for the first time. How did you then end up, so many years later, graduating from Aston University with a doctorate in biomedical science? How did you make that leap?
So during the Taliban regime, they were persecuting Hazaras, and my father at that time had to flee because of security reasons. And he then came to the UK, and he had asylum, claimed asylum here in the UK. And after he was accepted, then he sponsored his family to come to the UK. And so I moved to the UK at the age of 13. And at that time, I was 13. I was, at the age of 13, and it was 2006. And at that time, I had only gone to school just 2 years, because of Taliban regime, I couldn't really start the school at the appropriate age. But when I came to the UK, I had to start school from year 8. Not having, knowing the language or English, and having to start from there. But of course, the opportunity that was given to me and presented to me here in the UK, in Birmingham, was absolutely incredible. And just 10, 11 years after, I found myself pursuing a PhD, which was something that, I could never imagine doing if I was in Afghanistan. Or even now, women are stripped of their rights in Afghanistan. They're not allowed to go to school. They're not allowed to go to university. They're not allowed to go to work. And it's such a devastating and heartbreaking thing to sort of see and to look, seeing my cousins in Afghanistan experiencing that, and all of their dreams are shattered into pieces because of we're experiencing what I experienced in the 90s in Afghanistan.
It's almost as if for the Hazaras, Afghanistan has lurched back to the 1990s.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that we saw in the 1990s, we're seeing that even worse. We have thousands of Hazaras who are forcibly displaced by the Taliban. We have just since 15th August, since the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, we've had more than 400 Hazaras or Shias killed in targeted attacks. And so the violence against the Hazaras are actually has intensified. And, we've had many human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, who have reported their concerns that Hazaras are facing genocide under the Taliban regime. So we are facing a bleak future, and the situation of Hazaras and Shias in Afghanistan is deteriorating.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, May. At this point, I'm going to invite our other participants. Sam, if you can bring us all back together. Thank you very much indeed. I would like to, in the course of our discussion, come back to this story of the Hazaras that May has just been talking about, because it's fighting, isn't it? In the news, it's fighting with other stories about Peppa Pig and the Prime Minister and far more ephemeral and silly things. But first of all, we do have some questions that have been sent in by people who registered for the event. So I'm going to hand over to Stefan to share some of those questions with the panel.
Yes, a few questions have been pre-submitted before this panel, and I'll read one of those, but please, everyone in the audience, feel free to submit questions now as a reaction to what you've just heard, so we can ask those later. So there was one question about the role of education. What role can education, and especially secondary school education, play in raising awareness of the legacy of 9/11 on communities? And also whether particular subjects can play a particular role in educating pupils and students about the event itself and also its aftermath, as we've just heard. So this is really an open question to everyone who would like to say something.
I can go first because I have a bit of experience in that area. So I came to the UK at the age of 13. I was from Afghanistan. I started secondary school, so of course I would be called names such as terrorist, Taliban, this kind of thing, and then secondary school. And I think education, public education in this area is really, really important because of the perception people have. Things that they see on social media is not necessarily true. And so education, especially in secondary school, where children or students are at the age where they're able to comprehend this kind of information, is really important, so they have the right information and the right perception, the right idea of the event itself.
Yeah, Stefan, I'm just thinking, I keep coming back to my theme, the world as it should be and the world as it is. The world as it should be is more and more teachers able to support their students with what you guys do really well in higher education, is critical thinking. Because there's a particular curriculum, right, in history and in some of the other topics let's talk about secondary education. And it's like learned stuff for exams. When we go into schools in Citizens UK, we've got a number of member schools and we do community organizing workshops. The young people are brilliant at critical thinking, because they're allowed to kind of unpack, like you have done so masterfully this evening, with stories, with facts, with analysis. So I think it'll be really helpful, and because education is highly regulated, right, here in the UK, there's some really specific things that needs to be covered, and it will be really important. If I had my best teacher at school was my history teacher. My history teacher did not have anything on the wall apart from Liverpool Football Club from the 70s and 80s. How he managed to get us to enjoy history with just Liverpool Football Club posters is amazing. But the reason was how he told the storytelling and how he used us. I remember hearing about Kristallnacht and I think, no way, sir, seriously, they pulled that off. He says, yeah, like, and then of course I'm not surprised when I see things happening in the 90s and since. So I just think the idea of education is really important, but we need more support for the teaching profession and schools to help their kids and young people with critical thinking. I think the young people have that; they have a thirst for it. And I think I remember saying to my son's school, and I'm not going to say which one it is, but they're in trouble. It's like he did more rigorous stuff in primary school, like, you know, and you're kind of doing. I mean, my dad's an imam who's retired, and I grew up in the city with boring interfaith. Everyone said they loved each other. There was no Monday morning action. So that was the kind of scope of, like, you know, analysis. And this is like, you know, there's a lot more you can do. And you have, even within your own school, you have powerful stories. But I love to see teachers and amazing people out there to be a bit more courageous and you know, do things and thirst for things like history, sociology, and a bit more.
And yeah, can I? Yeah, just briefly. You know, this could be a very long disquisition on historical education. But I mean, just like, for example, like the longest war in the history of the Soviet Union, Afghanistan. The longest war in the history of the United States, Afghanistan. There were 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, none of which ended very well for the British. There's monuments in Birmingham to them. You can read the very first Sherlock Holmes novel where Dr. Watson discusses being in battle in Afghanistan. So there's just, you know, there's just so much different ways into this through history. And I just think that history and international relations are just really, they're more important now than ever. Like, we need people that can understand, that can put things in context, that can try to empathize about what it's like to be different human beings in different historical contexts, growing up in different cultures. And even if you're, you know, if there's any vice chancellors that ever listen to this, you know, even if having a history department didn't, you know, make as much money as another subject, it's a public good. Universities need to be involved in supplying this stuff. So to me, I just think that it's a no-brainer. Universities, schools, historical knowledge should be central to everybody. We should all, you know, we're all actors in a play. We should at least have some understanding of the plot.
Thank you, Andrew, very much for those words. Could I ask you, as the curator of a museum, what museums perhaps ought to be doing to try to exhibit and represent the sorts of histories that are connected to these stories that are still shaping our lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. And I mean, I think that universities play a extremely important role. More people get historical literacy from museums than from reading the English Historical Review or from reading the Review of International Studies. So museums are really important in educating and informing people about what's going on in the world around them. And it's certainly a responsibility that the 9/11 Museum took quite seriously. The Spy Museum takes quite seriously, and I know most museums, as a matter of professional ethics, take quite seriously. People are coming there. They're one of the most trusted institutions in society. I know that in this day and age that might not seem like you know, a tough ask with the reputation that politicians and journalists and so forth have. But museums are seen as really important institutions. They're something that we grow up with, and I think that they're an important place where identities and histories can be taught and negotiated.
Thank you very much indeed. Stefan, looking back at our list of questions that have been submitted, perhaps we could take another one.
Yes, none have been submitted in the course of this discussion, so I'm referring to one that had been pre-submitted. This one is about human rights and to what extent 9/11 has changed human rights in whichever direction. So this is really an open question, which I'm just reading to you. So any thoughts from any panelists on the connection between 9/11 and human rights?
I mean, I could just throw in a quick response. I mean, I think that human rights is a bigger, just to go back to history, this is like a conversation that has been developing and has been taking place. And there's a number of important inflection points in the 20th century, Helsinki, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN are involved. So this is a kind of conversation that's ongoing. And I think 9/11 and a lot of the things that happened after 9/11 here in the United States or in other countries, I think have definitely added to that conversation. And I think many people probably have a slightly more pessimistic view of human rights at this particular moment, given where we are globally and politically, and some of the post 9/11 changes. But it is a conversation, and it doesn't have to just go backwards. It can go forwards again, but it just takes people to get involved.
Yeah, May really talked about education as a human right. I mean, this is probably one aspect which is quite important. Any other reactions on human rights?
I mean, safety. The idea, I mean, May shares really powerful testimonies and stories of the kind of real profound targeting, persecution. But when you're out and about, when you're in, maybe not, let's say in Afghanistan, but here in Birmingham, your feeling of feeling safe, feeling not discriminated against. I was the other day, I was talking to a group of women. One of the women mentioned, the street cleaner on the high street called her a letterbox, and you know where that came from, because and the audacity, he's at work, right? He's cleaning the street and he calls a letterbox. And so, there's, as you kind of unpack, there are lots of tenets, but people don't feel safe. The largest rise in crime during the pandemic, well, there's two, domestic abuse and hate crime. That went up. Like, we were all locked indoors in our rooms like this, and if any crime go up, what goes up? Hate crime and domestic abuse. And so, of course, as you say, Andrew, it's pessimistic. And those of us who are involved in community organizing, and it's called broad-based community organizing, we work with different communities. Aston University is one of our principal partners, 29 different civil society institutions. We organize on the welcome of refugees from UN camps during in 2015 from Syria. Now, huge amount of work with people around the world to get the government to speed up, work harder on its pledges for Afghan resettlement. And that's international, but more local, the work around hate crime, making misogyny an indicator of hate crime is getting a lot closer. So we are involved in campaigns. And I think the one end point I just want to make on that point, human rights, is and as you set down, Andrew, like, what's the counter to kind of pessimism? The counter to pessimism is each other. Where we create politicalness between ourselves, and we understand the kind of different stories and journeys, and with that we we act together on things. That's where the hope is. Hope through that action. The hope isn't sitting and reading Twitter, because that is really going to let you down. Or the other extreme, just nothing wrong with Netflix, but being glued on Netflix. So it's when we, like organizations, that's why I want to do the history stuff. For me, I don't get to interact with history academics enough in my community organizing, because this moment, this 90 minutes of looking at a point in time, but we're not looking at a point in time, is really fun. And for me, countering pessimism is broad-based community organizing, because as much as I win campaigns, it shapes me, it shapes my community in ways that leaving it to public authorities with face paint and open days is never going to do.
I'm going to add something that question as well. So I think there's three aspects that I sort of came into my mind now. I'm just sort of semi-thinking out loud. So after 9/11, the United States and its allies, they took measures to protect their citizens from future terrorist attacks. These measures aim to increase security, but they have been criticized for violating human rights. But the effect of the 9/11 was that America and their allies decided to go to Afghanistan. And at that time, the entire Afghanistan's population didn't have any human rights, from the Hazaras to religious minorities to everyone, anyone who resisted the Taliban, there was no human rights. And so their presence in Afghanistan led to people demanding for equality, demanding for human rights, demanding for their basic rights, including women, including Hazaras and other religious minorities. And so they were saved from these human rights violations by the Taliban. However, we also know that there are a lot of reports against the international forces in Afghanistan who violated human rights of Afghan citizens when they were accused of being a member of the Taliban when they weren't. There's been a lot of incidents where they didn't really follow, the right procedures for whether this interrogating these citizens, Afghan citizens. So there has been a mix, like Andrew said, it's a conversation. But as someone who is from Afghanistan, I was saved by the international community's presence in Afghanistan. As a Hazara, I managed to gain my human rights in Afghanistan.
I think it calls for what Antonio Gramsci called pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will.
Thank you very much. Stefan, do we have any more questions you can share?
No, nothing at this stage. Nothing that hasn't been covered by some of the
by other comments.
By the comments, yeah.
Thank you very much. So I wonder if we could come back then to this idea of 9/11 having sent out, or the events of 9/11 having sent out a ripple right across the globe that in many ways continues, that is still shaping lives and changing lives. How different are things today? And I'd like to come to both May and Saeed first, and then to Andrew afterwards, if I may. How different are things today for, say, Muslims in the local community? Have a perception still the same as they were in those months following 9/11, where people began to associate terrorism and Islam close together? May, if you'd like to come back on that question also of the future of Afghanistan, I'd be interested to see what you both say about that particular point. Saeed, would you like to go first?
Yeah, have to. I think 9/11 is always a sad moment. Sad moment because since we've heard more of people's stories, credit to Andrew and loads of people who've been collecting testimonies and stories. And you know, at one point Andrew mentioned, like in New York, you know, you can almost talk to anybody and someone had a connection. Now we're finding more and more people who have a not a direct but a distant connection to someone they knew, and it includes someone who survived or who would have been there had something else had happened. So that there's a lot more reflection about what happened on those days, but at the same time, the reflection of that day is mixed with the experience of 20 years since. And right now, a lot of things have changed British public life. And I'm not going to directly say it was 9/11, but the trajectory is set, you know, where we've come out of Europe. We don't want to accept the European Court of Justice, huge range of stuff there. You know, we are talking about, we just heard the other day migrants dying on route. And for a lot of Muslims, I think Saeed Awazi, Baroness Saeed Awazi kind of described it quite powerfully the other day. People are really thinking, you know, do I start to think about elsewhere? Do I start to think about moving elsewhere? And we growing up, when we never thought about that, you know, we're Brummies, we're Brits, and that conversation is happening. But I wouldn't directly equate it to 9/11. What I will equate it to is the people who have managed to very powerfully, very sophisticated in ways to take over the public discourse. I've managed as a consequence to really shape their agenda. And the Muslim community always fares amongst the worst in almost all of those agendas as well. So right now, there is people like me who are pretty like, let's try and make the world a better place. Let's organize, let's work with everybody else. But in rooms like this is our front room, but in dining room around the corner, in up and down Birmingham, that conversation has had what Saeed Awazi was talking about. And for me, what was really profound is like, I'm talking to my Jewish friends and colleagues. That is always in the back of their minds. You know, the idea that at some point you might have to move. At some point you might have to go somewhere else. The idea of not feeling that's it, this is our roots, we're going to be here. I know a couple from one of the synagogues that we work with, you know, after the referendum, like, you know, moved because in their own lifetime, within their own parents' lifetime, they remember how things had changed. And for Muslims, this is a fairly new experience because, you know, we always thought we were Commonwealth citizens, right? Particularly those of us from the subcontinent. So right now, all of those factors are playing, and there's people like myself with one foot in the world as it is, another in the world as it should be.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Saeed. May, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, the situation, what it was and compared to what it is now, I think as I've sort of touched on and talked about at the start of my conversation, is that the situation was incredibly bad, but the presence of the international community gave people hope, gave the Hazaras a hope that is going to get better and that they're going to have their rights. But unfortunately, after the withdrawal of NATO, the situation has worsened for the Hazaras. So the 20 years that NATO and allies there were, I mean, in my personal opinion, were absolutely nothing, because for the Hazaras, when we were facing extinction, persecution, forced displacement in the 90s, it was sort of like just stopped for a while. and now that has sort of continued, but even intensified. So yeah, it's a horrible situation to be in, to have given this community a sense of hope for 20 years, to give them something to fight for 20 years, and all of a sudden that dream and that hope has been taken away from them just overnight after the withdrawal. So there is absolutely, if I see the changes that we see since 9/11 in my community, it's actually worse.
Thank you very much. Andrew, would you like to comment on this as a historian, as someone, indeed, as someone who's written about the USA and Afghanistan?
I think for me, 9/11, it's like an hourglass, the hourglass shape. So a whole series of historical events and processes feed into the hourglass, and then there's a pinch point, the area where it's narrowest, and that's 9/11. And then on the other side, there's a whole series of historical events and processes that come out on the other side. So for, say, someone here in New York who lost a family member on the day of 9/11, to them, that is the centerpiece of the story. Like, that's the main event. The stuff that came afterwards are just byproducts of the event that happened that caused the loss of their loved one. If you're, say, someone else that lost their life in Afghanistan 10 years later, then 9/11 is an important part of the story, but it plays a slightly different role, because for you, the most important part is when you lost your loved one. So different parts, I think, different chapters can be privileged by different people. Different processes can be interpreted in different ways by different people. But I think that there is connective tissue which brings all of this together, and I think that's what historians can do. Just like you can't think about Pearl Harbor without thinking about World War II. I don't think that historians, anyway, you can't think about 9/11 without thinking about all of the things that came out on the other side. And if we're thinking about all the things that went into it before the pinch point, I mean, we can go back to really wherever you want. We can go back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. We can go back to the importance of oil and the discovery of oil and the Middle East after World War II and the consequent securitization of the Persian Gulf. We can go back to the Sunni Shia schism. We could go back to the discovery of the Americas. I mean, we can go in all kinds of directions, but all of these things feed into it. We need to try to identify which were most important, which were long-term causes, short and precipitating events. And then on the other side, depending on our perspective, depending on our own background, we're going to focus on particular parts of the processes and events that come out the other side. But there's a really rich and interesting history there, and I think that there's enough here for historians to chew over for another couple of centuries.
Certainly. Thank you very much indeed. We're coming to the end of our time on this podcast, and I'd like to thank all our guests, Dr. Andrew Hammond, Mr. Sadul Haque Saeed, and Dr. Homira Rezai for their contributions and for a very rich and stimulating discussion at the end. And I think in particular, I'd just like to underline one thing that I've been reflecting on, listening to your memories and listening to Andrew's account of New York on 9/11, which is it's an expression that I've just come across recently about horizons of experience, and I think it's the German historian Khaolang has talked about the importance of understanding that people can go through the same events, but their own horizon from which they perceive that event and obviously experience the consequences of it can be quite different from another person's. And I think we've got we've heard, I think, some very interesting stories tonight of quite how different those experiences can be, of the effects of the same event, which can have such totally different results depending on the place and the time in which those effects are felt. And I think that only underlines as well the importance of the study of history as an important element in understanding other people, in understanding the complexity of events, or the complexity of things, as I often say to my students. So thank you once again. Let me thank also everyone who has joined us via the various platforms, YouTube and Twitter. Thank you to Professor Stefan Mans for being with us this evening. Thank you to Sam Cook, who is our producer behind the scenes, who's made everything run so smoothly. You can keep up to date with events going on here at Aston History, in the Aston History department, through our Twitter handle at Aston History, capital A, capital H. We do have a series of events coming up next year. We'll have an event in January on Holocaust Memorial Day, or around Holocaust Memorial Day. We'll advertise that event soon on social media. We'll have an event sometime in the spring, hopefully, on the history of the Hazara people. We'll return to this story of Afghanistan. And there'll also be events running later in the year on Indian partition and also on the Commonwealth Games. So thank you once again to everybody, and a good night to everyone who's watching.